The whisper in the market. In the bustling town of Kintaba, a place where faith and fear often walked hand in hand, whispers began to spread through the narrow alleys of the market. Traders selling yams and dried fish lowered their voices whenever the name of Pastor Emmanuel Offery was mentioned. To many, he was a celebrated man of God. His church was always full, his sermons fiery, and his promises of healing drew crowds from far and wide. He dressed in sharp suits, drove the newest cars, and spoke of blessings that poured down like rain from heaven. But beneath that polished smile and golden wristwatch, a darker rumor was taking root. Some claimed that the pastor's sudden wealth could not be explained by offerings alone. Old women muttered that the spirits of the land had seen something terrible. They said that eyes, human eyes, were missing from the graves at the edge of town. Others swore that a man once went to Pastor Offery for help and was never seen again. The whispers were fragile, like smoke, but they carried a heavy stench. And in Kintaba, where folklore and reality often blurred, such stories had a way of growing teeth, the first signs of darkness. The rumors grew louder in the weeks that followed. What had begun as faint murmurs in the market soon became heavy conversations whispered behind closed doors. In the evenings, when families gathered around fires to share food and stories, the name Pastor Offery returned again and again, never spoken loudly, but with a trembling caution. A young boy, only 12, was the first to speak openly. His mother had taken him to the cemetery one morning to lay flowers on his grandfather's grave. But when they arrived, something was not right. The ground above the old man's coffin had been disturbed, the soil freshly turned as though by the hands of a restless thief. The boy swore he saw flies circling where none should have been, and when his mother brushed away the loose dirt, she gasped and staggered back. The coffin had been pried open. Inside, the body lay still, but the sockets where eyes once rested were hollow, black, and empty. Fear wrapped itself around the family like a python. The mother wanted to run to the authorities, but her neighbors warned her to keep silent. "Do you not know who you speak against?" an elder hissed. "That man is powerful. His words are law in this town. If you accuse him, you may never wake up to see another sunrise." But the horror could not be contained. Within days, other families visited their loved ones' graves only to find the same dreadful sign, eyeless corpses staring blindly at the heavens. Some believed grave robbers were at work, others muttered that witches had returned to feed the dark rituals. Yet, more than once, someone claimed to have seen a familiar black SUV parked near the cemetery in the dead of night. The vehicle, with tinted windows and polished rims, was one only the pastor himself was known to drive. And so the whispers twisted into sharp-edged suspicion. Was the man who preached salvation on Sunday morning the same man who defiled the dead by night? The town grew restless. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men sharpened their cutlasses not for farming but for protection. The line between faith and fear blurred, and for the first time, people began to look at Pastor Offery with both reverence and dread, the first brave confrontation. By the time the third week passed, the tension in Kintaba had become almost unbearable. The market stalls were quieter than usual, and even the children hesitated to play in the open streets. Everyone knew someone whose relative had reported strange occurrences around the cemetery, but no one dared speak openly in fear of Pastor Offery. Yet, fear has a way of awakening courage in unexpected places. A young man named Kofi Mensah, a former churchgoer, could no longer remain silent. Kofi had grown up attending Pastor Offery's sermons, believing in his promises of healing and prosperity. But after his aunt's grave was found desecrated, her eyes stolen, he felt a fire of righteous anger and grief he could not ignore. One Sunday morning, he entered the grand church with a heart pounding like a drum. The congregation's chatter hushed when he stepped up to the front, straight into the pastor's glare. Pastor Offery, radiant in a white suit, smiled at him as though greeting a loyal follower, but Kofi's eyes were hard, piercing, unyielding. "You speak of God," Kofi shouted, his voice echoing against the marble walls, "but how can God bless a man who steals from the dead? Who takes their eyes to fill his pockets?" A gasp rippled through the church. Women clutched their children, some began to weep, while men exchanged nervous glances. The pastor's smile faltered, replaced by a cold, measured stare. "My son," Pastor Offery said, his voice smooth as oil, "you speak lies. God sees your heart, and he knows the truth. These accusations are the work of envy and the devil himself. Do you doubt the miracles you have witnessed? Kofi refused to bow. I doubt the lies you feed this town. My aunt's grave, her eyes, stolen. And you, how much wealth do you hold in your hands from these crimes? The congregation was torn. Some started whispering that Kofi was right. Others shook their heads, clinging to the pastor's charisma, repeating his teachings that faith and obedience would protect them. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. The pastor raised a hand, silencing the room instantly. You accuse me of deeds that would damn your soul to speak aloud. Leave now, Kofi, before your anger blinds you to the mercy I offer. Repent, or be cast into the darkness you seek to summon upon me. Kofi stood firm, his chest heaving with rage. The darkness is already here, he spat. And soon, this town will see what you really are. By the time he stormed out, a heavy silence filled the church. Rumors now had a face, a voice, and a challenger. And in that silence, the first real crack in Pastor Offery's golden image began to show. Outside, Kofi didn't know it yet, but his boldness had already set unseen forces in motion. Eyes, long hidden, were watching, and the pastor's secrets were far darker than anyone in Kintaba could imagine. The secret revealed. That night, Kofi could not sleep. His mind replayed every moment in the church, the pastor's cold smile, the murmurs of the congregation, and the weight of the horror he had uncovered. Something inside him insisted that fear alone would not protect the town. He had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying. Under the cover of darkness, he made his way to the outskirts of Kintaba, to the edge of the cemetery where the desecrated graves had been found. The moon hung low and pale, casting long, trembling shadows across the freshly turned soil. Kofi crouched behind a mound of dirt and waited. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint, metallic smell of decay. Then he saw it, a black SUV gliding silently along the dirt road, its headlights off. Figures emerged, cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden by masks that reflected the moonlight like dull mirrors. At their center, unmistakable even from a distance, was Pastor Offery, his hands glinting with something small and wet. Kofi's stomach churned as he realized the unthinkable. The pastor was carrying human eyes, carefully wrapped in cloth, placing them into a small, ornate box that seemed almost ceremonial. Kofi's mind reeled. This was no ordinary crime, it was a ritual. He remembered the old tales his grandmother had whispered about long-lost practices in the region, where men sought wealth and power by consuming the essence of the living or the dead. Eyes, she had said, were the windows to the soul. Those who collected them could see beyond mortal limits, manipulate fortune, and even extend their lives. A sudden sound made Kofi freeze. The pastor's accomplices were chanting softly, in a rhythm that made the hairs on Kofi's neck rise. Their voices carried the weight of something ancient, dangerous, and profoundly unnatural. Pastor Offery lifted the box, muttering incantations under his breath. The wind seemed to bend around him, and the trees shook as if bowing to an invisible force. Kofi realized the enormity of what he was witnessing. This was not merely greed, it was a dark covenant, one that could bring untold misfortune to anyone who dared interfere. Yet, despite the fear clawing at him, he knew he could not turn back. If the town remained blind to this, more graves would be desecrated, more families ruined. But just as he decided to step closer, a shadow detached itself from the group. A tall, gaunt figure, maskless, turned directly toward Kofi's hiding place. Its eyes, impossibly pale and unblinking, seemed to pierce the darkness itself. Kofi stumbled back, almost falling into the dirt, his heart hammering like a drum of war. The figure said nothing, yet in the silence, a single thought burned into his mind: we see you. Always. Kofi knew then that Pastor Offery was not acting alone. And the deeper secret of his wealth was more horrifying than anyone in Kintaba could imagine. Eyes were only the beginning. From that night on, the town's whispers became screams in the hearts of those who dared think too closely. And somewhere, in the shadowed corners of Kintaba, Pastor Offery's laughter echoed, rich, powerful, and unchallenged, for now. The web of deception. The next morning, Kofi returned to the town of Kintaba, but nothing felt the same. The streets were alive with the usual hustle, yet every smile, every laugh, seemed hollow. He saw the church in the distance, its white walls gleaming in the sunlight, a beacon of faith to the unsuspecting. And yet, he knew the darkness inside was unimaginable. Kofi began his investigation quietly. He approached families who had lost relatives and asked questions in hushed tones. Some denied seeing anything unusual, afraid of the pastor's wrath. Others nodded nervously, sharing fragmented stories of shadows near graves, whispers in the night, or sudden disappearances. Each account, no matter how small, painted a pattern, a network of fear, ritual, and greed that stretched farther than Kofi had imagined. It became clear that Pastor Ofori had allies. His assistants in the church were not ordinary helpers, they were enforcers, tasked with intimidating anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. The local police, too, seemed strangely indifferent, even when rumors of the graves were brought to their attention. Kofi realized with a sinking heart that Ofori's influence ran deep, touching law enforcement, local officials, and even some elders whose word was law in the town. Determined not to be silenced, Kofi sought out a former member of the church, an old man named Baba Kwame, who had once been Ofori's closest confidant. Hidden behind thick walls of ivy, Baba Kwame's small hut smelled of incense and dust. When Kofi told him what he had seen, the old man's face turned pale, his hands trembling. "You have seen what you were never meant to see, boy," Baba Kwame whispered, his voice hoarse. Emmanuel Ofori does not merely preach, he trades in the essence of the dead. Eyes, hearts, even blood, these are the instruments of his wealth. Every offering he receives, every miracle he performs, is part of a ledger that the living cannot see. And those who oppose him, vanish. Kofi shuddered. How does he get away with it? He asked. The old man's eyes were full of sorrow. Fear is his shield, superstition his sword, and loyalty, blind loyalty, his army. People in this town worship him not because they understand, but because they are too afraid to do otherwise. And mark my words, boy, if he suspects you know too much, you will become a name whispered in fear, like the others. But Kofi's resolve only hardened. He knew that to stop Ofori, he would need more than courage, he would need proof, allies, and a plan that no one could trace back to him. The web of deception was vast, and with every passing day, the pastor's power grew. Yet, deep within, Kofi felt a spark of hope. Darkness, he realized, could always be challenged, but only by those brave enough to step into it. As he left Baba Kwame's hut, Kofi noticed a black SUV parked at the edge of the village, its tinted windows gleaming in the sunlight. He froze. For the first time, he understood that the hunter and the hunted were now one step away from confrontation. And somewhere behind those windows, Pastor Ofori was already watching, planning, and smiling. The evidence of horror. Kofi could not sleep that night. Every creak of his small wooden house seemed amplified, and every shadow outside his window felt alive. He knew that Pastor Ofori's eyes were on him, even if he could not see them. The black SUV he had glimpsed earlier was no ordinary vehicle, it was a symbol, a warning. And Kofi knew warnings in Kintaba were rarely idle threats. Determined, he decided that the only way to stop Ofori was to gather irrefutable evidence. He began watching the church and the surrounding areas at night, taking careful notes of who came and went. Soon, patterns emerged. Certain nights, the pastor and his masked accomplices would leave town quietly, moving toward the cemetery or the dense forest beyond it. Others would transport unmarked boxes in the dead of night, their contents hidden beneath cloth and secrecy. One evening, Kofi followed a convoy of vehicles along a narrow, twisting path. His heart pounded as he saw the same cloaked figures he had witnessed before, standing around a small clearing illuminated by torches. From his hiding spot, he watched in horror as the pastor and his accomplices performed a ritual, chanting in a language older than the town itself. The centerpiece of the ritual was a table made of dark, polished wood. On it lay dozens of small boxes, each containing human eyes, their sockets preserved and glinting faintly in the torchlight. Ofori spoke words of power, and as he did, the eyes seemed to shimmer, almost alive, as if responding to his will. The accomplices carefully packaged the eyes into satchels and loaded them into the vehicles. Kofi's stomach churned. This was no superstition, this was a systematic trade, a black market of human body parts orchestrated by a man worshipped as a holy figure. He realized the enormity of the operation. Graves had been desecrated, families terrorized, and wealth amassed, all while the town slept, trusting the man they called a shepherd. The realization made Kofi's blood run cold. If this information ever leaked without solid proof, he might not survive to tell the story. But he also noticed something else, a faint symbol carved into the wood of the ritual table, hidden beneath the boxes. It was an ancient mark, one he had seen only in the old folktales Baba Kwame had told him. It represented greed, domination, and a pact with dark forces. The eyes, the wealth, and the pastor's power were all bound to this mark. Destroying it, Kofi realized, could unravel the entire operation, but only if he acted carefully. As the ritual concluded, the pastor turned suddenly, his eyes scanning the shadows. Kofi froze, pressing himself against the undergrowth, heart hammering. For a moment, it felt as though Ofori could see through the darkness itself. Then, with a chilling smile, the pastor and his accomplices vanished into the night, leaving Kofi with the knowledge of their crimes and a growing sense of dread. He now knew the truth. The human eye trade was real, systematic, and horrifyingly lucrative. And if Kofi wanted to stop it, he would need more than courage. He would need allies, cunning, and the nerve to confront a man who could see fear in the hearts of his victims before they even knew it existed. Allies in the shadows. Kofi knew he could not fight Pastor Ofori alone. The pastor's influence extended into every corner of Kintaba, church leaders, local officials, even some of the town's elders. Any direct accusation without proof could mean instant disappearance. He needed allies who were both brave and discreet, people willing to risk everything for the truth. His first thought was Baba Kwame, the old man who had confirmed the ritual. Returning to the hut under the cover of night, Kofi found the elder preparing a small fire, the smoke curling into the dark sky. "I knew you would come back," Baba Kwame said, his voice low and urgent. "You have the courage that others lack. But courage alone will not defeat him. You need strategy, and you need people who understand the danger." Kofi listened as Baba Kwame spoke of others, former churchgoers who had quietly left after witnessing strange occurrences, shopkeepers who had lost relatives to unexplained disappearances, and a few young men and women who had begun to question the pastor's miracles. Slowly, a small network formed. Each member was sworn to secrecy, their meetings held in hidden corners of the town, far from prying eyes. The allies shared horrifying stories: a man who had offered his savings to the pastor only to have his daughter disappear, a woman whose husband had fallen mysteriously ill after questioning Ofori, and even reports of children disappearing near the outskirts of the cemetery. Each tale strengthened their resolve. The pastor's crimes were real, and Kofi now had witnesses who were willing to take action. But they all knew the risk. "If he suspects us," one of the shopkeepers whispered, "we become like the graves in the cemetery, forgotten, robbed of our sight, and erased." The fear in their voices was palpable, yet beneath it burned determination. They began to plan carefully, mapping the pastor's movements, noting the nights of his rituals, and gathering discrete evidence, photographs, recordings, and even sketches of the ancient symbols Kofi had seen carved into the ritual tables. Kofi also realized something more frightening: Pastor Ofori's reach extended beyond Kintaba. Whispers of his influence in neighboring towns, even in distant cities, suggested that the human eye trade was part of a larger network, and that stopping him in Kintaba might provoke forces more dangerous than they had imagined. Still, the group pressed on. They trained themselves to move quietly at night, to blend into shadows, and to record without being seen. Every night, Kofi's resolve hardened. He knew that confrontation was inevitable, but only by acting strategically could they hope to survive and expose Ofori's crimes. And somewhere in his grand church, Pastor Ofori smiled knowingly. He could feel the stirrings of resistance, but he also knew that fear, superstition, and loyalty were powerful weapons. The real game was only beginning, and Kofi and his allies had stepped into a world where every shadow could hide danger, and every whisper could mean death, the tightening noose. The following days in Kintaba were thick with unease. Kofi and his allies huddled in secret, reviewing the footage and recordings from the night at the cemetery. Every frame, every chant, every flicker of the torches was proof of the horrors that had been whispered about for months. Yet, as they pored over the evidence, an oppressive thought hung over them. Pastor Ofori now knew that someone was watching. The pastor's public demeanor remained the same, charismatic, commanding, adored by the congregation, but subtle changes betrayed his awareness. Security had increased around the church, with new attendants checking every visitor. Surveillance cameras appeared in the most unexpected corners. Even casual conversations carried an undercurrent of caution, as if invisible eyes followed them everywhere. Kofi realized that they were in a race against time. The evidence they had was powerful, but without a strategy, they could be discovered and silenced before they could act. Baba Kwame advised patience. Rushing will only give him the chance to strike. You must lure him into a position where his crimes are exposed, undeniable to all, and where he cannot harm you or your allies. The group divided their tasks. Some focused on spreading subtle awareness among villages, planting seeds of doubt in conversations while avoiding direct accusation. Others analyzed the recordings, looking for unique details, symbols, ritual tools, even the specific location of the ritual grounds, that could be used to tie the crimes directly to the pastor. Kofi, ever vigilant, monitored the pastor's movements, noting any signs of panic or hesitation. It was during this time that a terrifying discovery was made. One of the former church members, a young woman named Amma, had received a mysterious note slipped under her door. It read simply, "We know who watches. Stop, or you vanish like the others." The group froze. The message was chillingly precise, a reminder that Pastor Offery's reach extended far beyond what they had imagined. Yet, instead of deterring them, it steeled their resolve. They realized that the pastor was not just a criminal, he was a predator, calculating and ruthless, feeding off fear, and capable of destroying anyone who dared defy him. Kofi began formulating a bold plan. They would need to expose Offery in a way that could not be denied, using both the recordings and the testimonies of the victims' families. But first, they had to gather more evidence, ensure the safety of their allies, and anticipate every possible counterattack. As night fell over Kintaba, the town seemed calm, but Kofi knew better. Every shadow could hide a spy. Every whispered prayer in the church could be a tool for manipulation. Pastor Offery was tightening his noose around the village, and the battle for truth had become not just a moral fight, but a deadly game of strategy, courage, and survival, the first public exposure. The tension in Kintaba had reached a breaking point. The town's whispers had grown louder, though no one dared speak openly about Pastor Offery's crimes. Kofi and his allies knew that subtle hints would no longer suffice. They needed undeniable evidence, presented in a way that could not be dismissed by the pastor's charisma or his loyal followers. They chose the next Sunday, when the church would be packed with hundreds of worshippers. Kofi's hands shook as he clutched a small projector and a laptop concealed beneath his cloak. Baba Kwame, Amma, and the others followed quietly, each carrying fragments of the evidence, photographs of the desecrated graves, recordings of the pastor's incantations, and documents noting the victims' identities. As the service began, Pastor Offery's voice thundered through the church, promising miracles, blessings, and wealth for those who remained faithful. The congregation hung on his every word, unaware of the storm about to hit them. Kofi and his allies waited for the right moment, hearts hammering in unison with the rhythm of the pastor's sermon. Finally, when Offery raised his hands for the closing prayer, Kofi pressed a button. The projector flickered to life, casting vivid images of the ritual grounds onto the church walls. Gasps filled the room. Faces went pale as the congregation saw the human eyes, the boxes, the masked accomplices, and the ancient symbols carved into the tables. A recording of the pastor's chant echoed through the hall, the words strange, chilling, and unmistakably his. For a moment, silence reigned. Then chaos erupted. Some worshippers screamed, rushing for the doors. Others wept openly, clutching their children. A few attempted to defend the pastor, shouting that the evidence was false, a lie of the devil. But the proof was undeniable. There was no denying the images, the recordings, and the eyewitness accounts. Pastor Offery's face, usually so controlled and composed, betrayed the first flicker of panic. He tried to speak, to reclaim the congregation, but his words were drowned out by fear, anger, and disbelief. Kofi felt a surge of adrenaline. This was their moment, the first real crack in the armor of the man who had terrorized the town. Yet, even as the pastor's power wavered, Kofi knew the danger was far from over. Offery had resources, allies, and influence that extended beyond the church. Exposing him in public was only the beginning. The real battle would come next, when the pastor struck back, trying to regain control through fear, manipulation, or worse. As the congregation began to disperse, Divided between horror and loyalty, Kofi realized that the fight for Kintaba's soul had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The human eye trade had been revealed, but the predator behind it was still free, and still watching. The pastor strikes back. Kofi had expected resistance after the public exposure, but nothing could have prepared him for the full force of Pastor Offary's retaliation. Within days, the town of Kintaba was gripped by fear unlike anything it had experienced before. Shops were ransacked, families who had spoken out against the pastor found threatening notes slipped under the doors, and whispers of disappearances began to circulate once more. The pastor himself appeared on the pulpit the following Sunday, his usual charm replaced with a cold, commanding intensity. He spoke of betrayal, of false accusations, and of the dangers of trusting rumor over faith. "The devil is clever," he said, his eyes scanning the congregation like a hawk. "Those who sow lies will face consequences, for God sees all." The words were carefully measured, but beneath them lurked an unmistakable threat. Kofi and his allies went into hiding, their movements cautious, their nights sleepless. They could feel the pastor's eyes everywhere, and every shadow seemed to hide someone sent to watch or intimidate them. Even Baba Kwame, wise and experienced, admitted for the first time that Offary's reach was terrifying. Then the first strike came. Ama, the young woman who had helped gather evidence, failed to return home one evening. Her door was ajar, her belongings scattered, and a faint scent of incense lingered in the air, a mark Kofi recognized from the rituals. Panic rippled through the group. They realized that exposing Offary had put them directly in the path of a man who dealt in fear, manipulation, and murder. The allies decided they could no longer operate quietly. They began documenting everything in even greater detail: the pastor's private meetings, the movements of his masked accomplices, and the locations of ritual sites. Every photograph, every recording, and every observation became a lifeline. The more Kofi uncovered, the clearer it became that Offary was not only exploiting the dead but also controlling the living through terror. At night, Kofi would lie awake, thinking of the eyes he had seen, the chants, and the rituals. He knew that Offary's desire for wealth and power was insatiable, and that the human eye trade was only a fraction of his influence. The pastor's retaliation was strategic, terrifying, and precise. He was testing the limits of fear in Kintaba, gauging how far he could push the town without losing his grip. Yet amidst the fear, Kofi's determination burned brighter. He knew that exposing Offary fully was the only way to stop him. The town's survival, and the memory of those who had been violated, depended on courage, strategy, and unity. The battle for Kintaba had entered its most dangerous phase, and the predator who had hidden behind the guise of faith was now fully aware that someone dared challenge him. As the night deepened, shadows moved closer to the village, and Kofi understood the truth: Offary would not relent, and neither could they. The struggle for justice, and survival, was no longer a choice. It was inevitable. The final plan. Fear gripped Kintaba like a living thing. The pastor's retaliation had left the town in chaos. Families lived in terror, whispers of disappearances spread like wildfire, and even those who had remained loyal began to question the man they had once adored. Kofi and his allies, huddled in a hidden room beneath Baba Kwame's hut, knew that time was running out. They had survived intimidation and threats, but the pastor's power was still growing. Each day that passed without decisive action gave Offary the chance to strengthen his grip, recruit new followers, and silence any dissent. Kofi realized that exposing him fully would require a strategy unlike anything they had attempted before. Baba Kwame spoke first, his voice grave. "We must strike in a way that cannot be ignored, in a way that shows the town the truth, and forces the authorities to act. But this will be dangerous. There is no turning back." The plan was meticulous. First, they would gather the families of the victims, those brave enough to come forward, and have them testify about the desecrated graves and missing eyes. Next, they would present the recordings and photographs from the secret rituals, carefully compiled to show the full extent of Offary's crimes. Finally, they intended to reveal the ancient symbols and rituals, showing the supernatural lengths the pastor had gone to amass wealth and power. Kofi knew this would require precision and courage. Any slip could mean death, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The allies practiced moving quietly, avoiding detection, and communicating silently in the crowded streets. Every movement, every signal, had to be perfect. As they prepared, Kofi reflected on the magnitude of what they were about to do. Ofori was not merely a criminal, he was a predator who had weaponized fear, superstition, and faith itself. To defeat him, they would need to turn the very tools he used against him, expose his secrets, reveal his lies, and show the town the horror he had hidden behind the mask of holiness. The night before the confrontation, Kofi couldn't sleep. He walked to the edge of the village, staring at the darkened church. Somewhere inside, Pastor Ofori was undoubtedly aware of the growing threat. Kofi felt a mix of fear and determination. The predator had hunted for years, but tomorrow, the hunt would reverse. As the moon hung low and pale in the sky, Kofi whispered to himself, "We will not let the dead be forgotten. We will not let him rule through fear any longer." The allies were ready, the evidence was prepared, and the final battle for Kintaba's soul was about to begin.